Central banks around the world have made it their mission to support the global economy. This is what happened. You came here for the truth, so let me unveil that for you. Today we will look at a few charts and a few additional pieces of information, beginning with this right here. Total central bank assets. We're looking at the Fed, the ECB, and the Bank of Japan. And you will see one very consistent element throughout, and that is they love to print a lot of money. That has been going on not just since the financial crisis, but that's really when the spark was lit. And you will see an extreme amount that has been added during that time frame. But ever since then, global central banks, $200 billion per month. And you have to think, that has to make its way around the world at some point. It can't remain stagnant. That's the whole point of these central banks, is that they increase or decrease liquidity as they see fit. And that's what controls the markets. If they want the markets to come down, they pull back on the liquidity. They have that choice at any moment. This is the Wilshire 5000 index versus the federal debt versus the FFR percent. What we are looking at here with the Wilshire is essentially, think of it as all of the stocks, the value of all of the stocks. What does it come to? And that gives you a good indication globally of how things are doing. Then you have to look at the Fed funds rate. So the Fed funds rate over time has, since 1980, been declining, and that has allowed all of this to take place. This is sort of laying underneath all of the decisions that are being made by individuals, by banks, by everything else. Having a low interest rate really distorts everything because they figure, well, you know what? If I would normally do this, but instead I'm not making any money there, so I have to do this instead. And that really allows the central bankers to fuel bubbles. That's what's happened. And then we look at the federal debt, and that is one of the biggest bubbles that we have seen, increasing dramatically. No different than the stock market bubble, because just like the federal debt, it has been increasing dramatically. And this is all a direct result of the central banks printing money. If you want to show these two on top of each other, you will see a direct correlation between the money printing and the stock prices. Most people would say, well, then it's better to be in stocks than it is to be in cash. And to some degree, I would have to agree with that. Because cash, except for, a small amount kept on hand as sort of an emergency, cash loses value over time. We know that to be certain. So you want to be in assets instead. That's a general term, the way I would describe it, the way I described it in my first book in particular. And essentially, that's a fact. But you have to understand what has happened in order to get it to these levels. We're talking about extreme amounts of debt. It's not normal. This isn't historically something that has happened before. One of the factors here that we have to be worried about is the projections of a continued declining population in many areas. Look at the developed world, and you have to realize that a lot of these countries, they don't have the birth rates that they need in order to sustain everything that they've promised. With all the Ponzi schemes, social assistance programs, there's not enough people paying in. Connected with that, there are now more indexes than stocks. The number of market indexes now exceeds the number of U.S. stocks. Traditional ones, such as the S&P 500, are collections of securities weighted by market value, and it goes on. So the reason I mention this anyway is to essentially to show you that the underlying value of that stock, whether it's the Apple stock, what Apple does is actually a small portion when you think about the stock market, because there's so many factors. There's interest rates. There's what's happening politically. There's what that company is doing on its own. There are particular regulations and laws that may change things. There may be geographical problems. There is a whole host of issues that could affect that particular stock or stocks in general. So what that company does many times has less of an importance compared to, all of these other factors. That's the reason I mentioned this anyway. In the most cashless society on the planet, even God now accepts digital payments. What we're talking about is Sweden, and how at churches you can even donate using plastic. This is the way it is. A rapid shift going towards cashless. Sweden is leading the charge. Does that mean if you live in Sweden that you can't pay with cash? No. What it means is that very, very quickly, cash is making its way out of circulation. And a lot of people find it easier to transact with plastic, or they're using their Apple Pay systems or Bitcoins or anything else. And I'm not denying the fact that maybe it's easier. I just like to highlight the fact that the cashless society is one of the goals of the globalists. And that, for that reason alone, we have to be a little bit wise. This here just talking about that whole ransomware issue that was taking place, and it's affected basically globally from what I can understand here. And this has been a big issue. The reason I mentioned is not to talk about the details of that, but when we put our money in the institutions, when we have our data kept with different establishments, or on our own computers, or in our cell phones, or we have everything important relying on somebody else, we take a risk. And that is too much to risk. From travel agents to translators, rising toll of jobs taken by robots, although the nail technicians, security officers, and kitchen staff are in greater demand. I mentioned this just basically once again to talk about the loss of jobs due to automation, and we see the robots delivering food door to door. We see the taxi drivers being at risk, bus drivers, everything to do with driving is at risk right now. A lot of jobs are going to be lost. The jobs are not being replaced. That's just the way it is. And I think that there's the double-edged sword here, where you have a lot of technology helping people out. At the same time, the technology is taking away some jobs. And that's just the way it is. So that's all for this video. If you found it informative, please give me a thumbs up. Last but not least, if you found the video informative, I know you will find my books, The Money GPS and Global Economic Collapse, even more informative. If you want to flip through the books, just go over to Amazon, because they have a look inside feature that's going to allow you to flip through the pages of these books so you can see if you like them. Take care.